Hello and welcome to the Theology Mill podcast brought to you by Whitfinstock Publishers. My name is Zach Mickle and I am on the staff here at Whitfinstock and the host of this podcast, which consists of interviews with leading authors and thinkers in theology, biblical studies, and philosophy. On this episode, I had the chance to talk with Dr. Andrew Barron about his new book, Human Difference: Reflections on a Life in Proximity to Disability. Dr. Barron was an adjunct faculty at the Center for Spirituality, Disability, and Care at Martin Luther University College, and he's also previously taught disability and theology at Wycliffe College at the University of Toronto. He's married to Laura and is the father of Rafael, Ketzia, and Simona. So without any further ado, let's head over to the interview. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Okay, I am here, very happy to be here with Dr. Andrew Barron, who's the author of the book Human Difference: Reflections on a Life in Proximity to Disability. So welcome, Andrew. It's great to have you on. I know we've been through a bit of a crucible trying to just get this scheduled and keep to the scheduled time slot. So I'm glad that we were finally able to make it happen. As we kind of get going, could you maybe share just a little bit about yourself with our listeners, maybe a bit about your work and maybe your kind of research and writing too?
Well, thanks, Zach. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I am a Jewish follower of Jesus. I grew up in a Jewish home in a Jewish neighborhood in New York City in the 1960s. I had a traditional Jewish upbringing. My grandparents were from Eastern Europe, and our first language, in the home was generally Yiddish. I went to Hebrew school. I went to public school. I loved everything that there was to love about being Jewish, the language, the literature, and my lineage. But eventually my interests moved to science and astronomy and physics.
Hmm.
I moved down to Florida from New York when I was 18 to study at a small engineering school, Florida Institute of Technology. And when I was in graduate school, a friend of mine gave me a New Testament. And I looked at it and I knew what it was, but I was ashamed and I felt illiterate because I didn't know what was in it. And I knew that it was really an important book. And I told my friend, well, this is not for me. It's for Gentiles. It's not for Jews. And he said, no, it's a Jewish book written by Jewish people for Jewish people. I said, no, it's not. And I felt kind of foolish that I really didn't know what I was talking about. And he said, well, just open it up to the first book and read the first sentence, Matthew chapter 1. And I read it, the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, son of David, son of Abraham. And quite honestly, I looked up at him and I said, what are these Jews doing in this book? And it's a story for another day. But eventually, I did come to put my hope and my faith in Jesus the Messiah. A year or so later, I felt called to ministry, and I spent 38 years, very happy years, serving with the Jews for Jesus ministry here in Canada, in the United States, and all around the world. But currently, I am a full-time caretaker for our 29-year-old son who has Down syndrome. I'm also teaching disability studies at local colleges, universities, and I'm looking for new ways to view the sacred text through a disability lens. And in the research that I've done, in my theological reflection, I've concluded quite obviously that we live in a world of human difference, but God wants us to live in that kind of a world. And it's for our own flourishing. And in my reflection, I want to try to understand and embrace the uncertainty that comes with living this kind of life when you're in proximity to difference and disability, and to try to cope with that and to be enriched by the ambiguity of all of that. And ultimately, my reflection is trying to understand all of these very complicated questions when you're in proximity to disability. What is the human body? What does it mean to be normal? What does it mean to be able-bodied or disabled? What does it mean to exercise human care? And where is God in all of this? And how does God meet Rafi? That's the name of my son, Rafi.
Mhm.
And theologically, I've come to the conclusion that God is caught up in all of this. He's concerned, he's involved, he's connected, he's associated. He actually implicates himself in human disability. When Moses was complaining to God about this mandate, to lead the children of Israel, and he was complaining and he said, I don't have the right mouth for it. There's something wrong with my mouth. We don't exactly know what it was, but he had some kind of disability in his mouth,
Mhm.
whether it was a stutter or a cleft palate, we don't know. But the text says, in response to this, God says, who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord? I will help you and I will teach you what to say. As an aside, I had a student once who was a speech pathologist, and for her final paper, she did a paper on Moses visiting her clinic and coming into her office and explaining to her that he had to lead the children of Israel out of Egypt, but he had this problem. So the whole paper was her giving him advice and exercises and helping him through the whole effort of trying to figure out how to use his mouth. And it
Mm.
was terrific. But the scripture throughout tells us that God takes responsibility for all this, and he says, I'm going to help you. In Job, it says he wounds, but he also binds up. He injures, but his hands also heal. But then in Leviticus, do not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block in front of the blind, but fear the Lord your God. And so a whole class of people is protected. And this is a radical progressive idea in the ancient world. And these are
Mm.
some of the things, that I've thought about as I've done theological reflection and writing and teaching in this whole area. But there's a lot more to say.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, we'll get into some of the things you're already bringing up for sure in more detail, and especially as you kind of work through them in your book. But before we get into that, I have to ask my opener question, which is if you could place any three thinkers, or we could say any three people. They don't have to necessarily be intellectual figures or anything like that. But any three people, dead or alive, if you could place them together in a room and listen into their conversation, which three would you choose and why?
Well, this was a pretty easy question for me because the three people who have influenced me the most in regards to disability reflection are C.S. Lewis, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and John Swinton. Now,
Hmm.
Lewis didn't write a lot about disability, and I would have loved to have heard him teach about it or talk about it. But it's interesting that in Narnia, disability comes up concerning this magician, Koryukin, who transforms the duffel pads so they were unable to move except by jumping around. And some people have suggested that Lewis was drawing comparison to his own disability, which had something to do with his thumbs not functioning normally. And
Hmm.
apparently, this was one of the reasons that he began a career in writing. And his handicap, if you will, led him to discover his purpose in life in the same way as the Duffers found advantage in their new form as monopods.
Hmm.
Lewis has affected my thinking in so many other areas, but I would have loved to hear him talk with Dietrich Bonhoeffer about this because in 1933, Bonhoeffer visited a community of disabled people with epilepsy, and the name of the community was called Bethel. And as he reflected on this, he says that it was his first experience of human difference in disability. And it became a kind of personal revelation to him, his first experience of human difference in disability. And it provoked insight into the nature of human existence for Bonhoeffer and the vulnerability and defenselessness of people who are disabled.
Hmm.
And so for Bonhoeffer, all human life had worth, and even the most profoundly different and disabled he said, were of value. And he recognized the value of human life as independent of utility or commodification. And as the years went by, in Bonhoeffer's writing, you can see that he becomes increasingly indignant over the Nazi euthanasia program because they wanted to eliminate disabled life. And he preached a sermon in 1934 about this at St. Paul's in London, warning against the disdain for disabled life. And in that sermon, he envisioned a relationship, a shared bond, if you will, between all human beings, where this whole issue of power and weakness was completely irrelevant. And so for Bonhoeffer, he talks about this category of being in Jesus as the fundamental ground of belonging. And this is what prompted him to write that great book, Life Together.
Mm-hmm.
And in that book, he has this very profound quote about the church. He says, quote, "The exclusion of the weak and insignificant, the seemingly useless people, may mean the exclusion of Christ."
Mm.
And the living partner here is Dr. John Swinton, who is probably one of the greatest living thinkers on disability and theology. He's profoundly affected my thinking, and I was very fortunate to have him endorse my book. And in correspondence, with him about all of this, I was telling him a little bit about Raffi. And he wrote that people like Raffi are created in the image of God. And he says that begs the question, well, what kind of God would do that?
Mm-hmm.
And, and he writes, if we interpret Raffi's body as quote unquote not normal, then does that mean that he has not been created in the image of God? Or perhaps that God created him mistakenly? Is Raffi a consequence of sin or distortion? Our bodies and their differences tell us something about God. Disability reveals the God who we worship is quite different from our unreflective assumptions. And so, over the past 10 or 12 years, I've tried to read everything that Swinton has written. And he's got quite a number of sermons and lectures on YouTube. And he's quite a prolific and cogent thinker in this whole area of disability and theology. So those three together would have been a real joy to me to hear them talk about Raffi. And hopefully, I imagine bringing Raffi into the conversation and having him there and them asking him questions about what his life is like. I think that's one of the great intellectual exercises that I would have in imagining these three great soldiers.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I've enjoyed John Sutton's work a lot. We've actually had him on the podcast. I think it was maybe years ago now. But yeah, him and honestly just at Aberdeen in general, it seems like they've got some really great disability theology stuff going on. Like I know Brian Brock is another person there who's writing some really interesting stuff on disability theology. Okay, so let's get into maybe your story with your son Raffi a little bit. So you have a foreword by Ephraim Radner, who's no lightweight theologically. But in that foreword, he says that your son Raffi is in a way the center of this book. So could you say maybe just a little bit about, you said a bit already, but maybe a bit more about your son Raffi and kind of how he figures within this book of yours, and then maybe also kind of how your experience parenting him also figures within this book.
Just as an aside, I did my doctoral work at Wycliffe College at the University of Toronto and had the privilege of getting to know Ephraim. And as a result of that, Ephraim's been in my home many times and he's got to spend some time with Raffi. And when I wrote the book, I asked if he would write the foreword because of his understanding, as best he could of Raffi, and he was able to do that. But we were serving with Jews for Jesus in South Africa when Raffi was born. I was 33, 34. My wife was 28, 29. So we had no reason to expect, that our son would be the kind of difference, that we would have to label disability.
Mm-hmm.
But Raffi's difference lay in that chromosomal composition that we all have. those kind of small bundles of genes that have a lot to say about how we develop in our minds and bodies. And if you think about it, all of those differences were already there. They're present when he was conceived. And as he was laying there, curled within my wife, he was invisible to us, but he was there. He was Rafi.
Mm-hmm.
And his birth was perfectly normal. It was the middle of the night. The doctor wasn't concerned. He said, go home, get some sleep, come back and bring your family home. And I was in South Africa and I called everybody, it was the firstborn, and I was so excited. I called my friends and family, my peers.
Yeah.
And right after I finished calling, I was trying to get some sleep. The doctor called and he said I needed to come in. I said, why? He said, you better come in. I said, why? He said, I'm pretty sure I did it. I examined your son. He looks fine. But you need to know that I'm pretty sure that he has Down syndrome. And, quite honestly, everything sort of went into slow motion. I got dizzy. I got nauseous. I was heaving. And I remember thinking, well, no, this can't be right. This is not my life. This is somebody else's life. And everything was just very, very slow. And then I remember thinking, as I was trying to wake up and get myself together, I remember thinking, if I cannot handle this, then my life is really a lie. And I was really trying to pull it together. But everything was just upside down, and I realized that as I was driving into the hospital, in Johannesburg in the middle of the night, that my whole life was changed. From that moment on, nothing would be the same. Everything was kind of weird. And I remember yawning and swallowing and breathing in very strange ways. And it caused me to remember C.S. Lewis's Grief Observed when his wife died. He had the same sort of symptoms where he was yawning a lot and swallowing a lot, and he was breathing and he was very conscious of his breath. And I thought, I just want to stop breathing. I just want to end I want it to be over. And it was really interesting remembering Lewis and then going back and reading him and seeing so many similarities in his experience and mine. But the difference, obviously, is that it was, for Lewis, it was this terrible loss. But for me, I was sort of looking into the future and thought, this is going to be with me for the rest of my life. Everything is going to be different. This lifetime of lament and grief. It's not one loss. It's just this constant series of losses. And so Rafi was in this great hospital. They took really good care of him. He was going from test to test. They wanted to make sure everything was working fine. And finally, we ended up with the pediatric cardiologist, and he was checking for a hole in his heart. And as they were taking care of Rafi, I noticed there were a couple of nurses and the doctor, and they were gossiping. They were just talking about life and stuff, and who was dating who was marrying who. And I realized, for them, it's Tuesday. And for me, my life has completely changed. People were going to work, people were eating breakfast, people were going about their lives like it was another day. For the people in the hospital, it was just a shift on Tuesday. For me, it was the end of my life and the beginning of a new life. And it was a very strange experience. And then after the doctor said, hey, he's fine. We're just going to keep him one more day, then you can take him home. I looked up at him and I said, he doesn't look like he has Down syndrome. And the doctor said, well, no, he doesn't. He looks like you. And he said, I know that you're shocked, but you take care of him and he's going to surprise you. And you love him and he's going to love you back. And he kept on examining him, and he took off his little diaper and he was checking out his abdomen. And as he was doing that, Rafi just peed all over the doctor's face.
Oh my gosh.
And Rafi was like barely a day old, but he giggled. And it was the same giggle that Rafi has today. And I thought to myself, it's going to be all right. He's Rafi. he's Rafi. I'm not going to define him that way. He's my son. He looks like me. And my wife and I just came to terms with it, that this was an assignment from God that we had to embrace, but it was an assignment that was never ever going to end, and it was going to be with us for the rest of our lives.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, yeah, thank you for sharing all that. I feel honored that you share with me and with all of our listeners too. Yeah, I know one thing just from reading your book, one thing that kind of came up for you in raising Rafi and just be like, being in proximity, right, to Rafi, were kind of confronting all these notions of normality, which you mentioned already, right? And you talk about this in your opening chapter, right? All these ideas about like what makes a body normal, kind of how we as a society judge people according to certain norms, right? So is there in your mind kind of a distinction between like normality and abnormality on the one hand, and then difference on the other? Because it does seem like you favor that term difference, right? Obviously, it's in the book title, but it seems like throughout the book itself, you favor that term difference versus normality. Do you see these as different? And then, if so, how are discussions around difference maybe distinct from like in what ways are they distinct from discussions around kind of normalcy and norms?
Yeah, it's a complicated question, but disability for me is a way of naming difference, but it's not necessarily the best way of naming difference.
Mm-hmm.
So disability stands in a unique relation to a life story, a life narrative. And so when there's a deviation, like from what we think is normal, it provokes an explanation. Like a normal body, quote unquote, passes without narration. But if there's an obvious difference, a scar, a limp, a missing limb, or an obvious prosthetic or Down syndrome, then all of a sudden you think, oh, there's a story there. You know,
Mm-hmm.
a story that there needs to be an explanation. So people who present unexpected anomalous bodies are called upon, and you have to account for your difference. And the
Mm-hmm.
question obviously is, what happened to you?
Yeah.
You know, one of the social burdens of disability is that it exposes individuals, to inspection, to
Yeah.
interrogation, and often a violation of privacy. I'd be very happy if more people would ask me, "Oh, is that your son? What's that like?" People are afraid of invading my privacy, but I know that Rafi, when people meet Rafi, there's a story there, and most people are embarrassed to ask about the story because it's an interesting story, I think, but most people are scared of it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, Zach, that inside of us there is no normal. The norm is difference, and we choose what kind of differences are acceptable. There are many ways to be normal, right? Our ideas of it shape personal thinking and cultural thinking. But I think that the word difference is not neutral. It's deeply theological and social and anthropological, and it goes to the heart of what it means to be a human being. So what is difference? When we think of human difference, we focus on the disabled. When it comes to human difference, the disabled are probably the most fundamentally least recognized and least remembered, and the most life-threatening group of people with a name difference. But disability is only one piece of that puzzle. I think that disability is simply a cultural marker for human difference. It's a consensus that we've come to, right? That some things are normal, some things are not normal. So, although it is necessary, obviously, to access services and to help people to have their needs met, it's just something that people make up.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be very negative. So, when Rafi turned 18, we qualified for disability income. So we had to fill out a whole bunch of paperwork, and the doctor had to verify this was his diagnosis. And there were a lot of boxes to check off about what he could and couldn't do, his orientation to time and place. And quite honestly, the more boxes you checked off, the more money you got.
Yeah.
It's not like we lied, but this is the way society has dealt with this. Rafi is different. He needs help. And we have to figure out and label that help based on that difference. So again, disability is a way of naming difference, but it's not the best way to name difference. The only thing that's normal is difference.
Yeah, absolutely. How would you say the difference of disability? How would you say that this challenges the quote unquote able-bodied person, their sense of maybe like security or sovereignty over their own body, right? We all kind of operate under this, whether it's real or unreal, this kind of sense of having sovereignty over our own bodies, right? So how does an able-bodied person's sense of that, how is that kind of challenged by disability? And then, yeah, maybe kind of as a follow-up question to that, what do you think able-bodied people might be kind of prone to missing? And then how do kind of disabled bodies bring kind of better or more honest, maybe understandings of embodied existence into kind of clearer focus for us all?
Yeah, it's a big and complicated question.
Yeah.
And our bodies are interesting things. Rafi has an interesting relationship to his body.
Yeah.
And the most interesting thing about Rafi's body is that he's completely comfortable being naked around strangers, which is
Hmm.
not something we encourage, but he doesn't care about nakedness. He has no shame. And I've thought about that an enormous amount. He's just completely innocent in a way of nakedness. But when I think of his body, I think of God creating Adam and Eve with bodies. So the body, if you think about it theologically, is the central aspect of being created. He created bodies. And
Hmm.
if you think of our parents, Adam and Eve, they used their bodies. They walked and they talked and they ate, they drank, they played. They were subject to gravity, just like us. They had experiences in the body. But the body is presented in the sacred text as a gift. And God's ultimate endorsement of the body is in the incarnation. Jesus' body becomes the body for God's redemptive activity. But the biblical tradition says in the Psalms that I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. So the body is a gift. Mine is a gift. Yours is a gift. So is Rafi's body a gift? Is it fearfully and wonderfully made? And I say, yes, his body doesn't keep him from communion, service, or worship of God, and that his body does God's work. Now, Rafi's body is different, obviously. But he uses his body in the same way we do it to interact with the world. And this has to be, on some level, a form of grace for him and for us. It's all that Rafi has. He just has that one body. And we have to embrace his body and how he uses it, even though it's not resolvable. So what he does with his body, in some way, is how he serves God. And so in some way, just like you and me and everybody else, his body is his mission. And that I hope that he uses whatever kind that he has. And I hope that we can acknowledge that his body, just like mine and yours, is a gift. And we have to remember theologically that the great hope that Christians have of the resurrection places our bodies as the focus of destiny. We all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that each may receive the thing done in the body. 2 Corinthians 5. So Rafi's body, it's his own, but not in the sense that it's always guarded by others and cared for and protected by many people. So, we like to say our body is ours, but I think there's a lot more to consider. The Bible maintains that God owns our bodies and that our bodies are important, and what we do with them as a result is important. And, we could think of, well, what is a beautiful body? What is a normal body? I don't know if that question can be answered. But we live in fear of difference
Mm-hmm.
and comparison. And we look and compare, and our bodies are found wanting. So, how do we decide who is beautiful? What is the proper body? There is no such thing. And so, Rafi's body doesn't need to be justified. Neither does mine or yours. Rafi's body is what it is. It
Yeah.
doesn't need to be compared to anything. Comparison is the thief of joy in all of this. So to think rightly about the body is to think of our what it means to be creative, independent, and distinct. But Rafi's body will always need to be cared for. He can't take care of it himself,
Mm-hmm.
and that's in another chapter. So we have this gift, in a body, and we're invited into the world and into the human community through our bodies, and so we access the world through them, and so does Rafi. We say we want to be autonomous, we want to do things ourselves, we want to be left alone, and that notion is toxic to
Mm-hmm.
people like Rafi who need to be cared for. So we have to remember that we encounter the world through our bodies. The body is a source of knowledge, but nobody encounters the world in the same way. There's no point in which we can say this experience is normal. There's a range of possibilities, not bad or good, just different.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I think of Rafi's body, it's distinct from mine, but it's dependent on me. It's dependent on people who take care of him. So caring for the body of another person, but also eventually being cared for, is really what it means to be a human being.
Mm-hmm.
You know, all all of our bodies, they work until they don't work, right?
Yeah.
They fail and they hurt. They give comfort to others. So we come to terms with the fact that we have these bodies and they occupy the world, and we're here. Our body's here. It's nowhere else. This is where we start. This is where we end. And we all have ordinary and extraordinary experiences and needs in conventional and non-conventional bodies. We don't like being cared for, but Rafi does, and he has a gift in
Mm-hmm.
that way. So I would say that my vocation is to care for Rafi's body. His vocation is to receive care. We care for our infants and children, and we take joy in that, and we have hope in that. We also take care of the elderly, but we think that in the middle portion, we shouldn't have to be cared for or give care. But we lose our humanity when we believe that, and we don't come to terms with that reality that all of
Mm-hmm.
life is caring and being cared for.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think that dovetails nicely to another question we have here. So let's jump over the question about time and disability. Maybe we can come back to it. But since we're talking about care, I want to maybe just press into that a little bit deeper, right? So you're talking about this kind of universal experience of needing the care of others and how our lives are kind of bookended by that. And then for a lot of us, the bulk of our life in the middle between those bookends is sort of denying or neglecting this need we have of being cared for by others. So I guess just to press in a little bit deeper, specifically in our culture, maybe Euro-American culture, or we're both in North America, so maybe even more specific to North American culture. In what ways do you kind of see us resisting this acknowledgement or this allowance for others to kind of care for us? And then why, right? You're talking about how really it's a universal human experience. So why is it important for us to remember that caring and being cared for are good and healthy parts of being human beings, of being relational and interdependent beings?
Well, Rafi needs constant care. I mean, he's a fairly highly functional man with Down syndrome, but he's not oriented to time and place, and he doesn't know how to take care of his own body. And so we have a series of helpers who come and help us, so we can get relief.
Hmm.
And just around the block from us is Tyndale University, which has a lot of young students who are studying Bible theology, psychology, early childhood education. And so I draw a lot of helpers from there. And I'll never forget one year, I found this very young girl, freshman Melissa, and she was interested in helping and getting paid to be Rafi's helper. And I said, well, Rafi, Rafi needs help with everything, including showering and shaving and toileting and all of that. And
Mm-hmm.
I said, do you have any experience with that? She said, no, but I'll try. I said, okay, well, come over and we'll, I'll show you his routine. So she came over for dinner, and then after dinner, Rafi went to the bathroom, and I said, and after he goes to the bathroom, he proudly says, I'm ready, and then we go, and I have to clean him up. And she came with me, and she watched me do it. And then we went up to the shower, and he got naked, and I took care of him, and he went in the shower, and her eyes just got really, really big.
Yeah.
And I said, are you okay? And I was washing him and cleaning all of his bits and parts and nooks and crannies
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
shaving him. And Rafi was like just having, it was just another night for him. And she said, I'm sorry, I've never seen a naked man before. I said, well, Rafi is not ashamed. I said, if you're not ashamed, he won't be ashamed. If you enjoy taking care of Rafi, he'll enjoy being taken care of. And
Yeah.
I think you'll find it to be a meaningful experience. And the next day, she took charge and she toileted him and showered him and shaved him. And I was listening. And as I was listening, she was doing all of that and having a conversation with him. And Rafi was talking to her, and they were giggling and laughing and talking about something else. And she came out of the shower with, she didn't go in the shower with him, but she was helping him. And they came out, and he was in his pajamas, and she had just had this really big smile on her face.
Mm.
And she was a helper for several years. And now Melissa's got 3 sons of her own. But, she told me that experience changed her life.
Huh.
And everybody that takes care of Rafi and has to do all of that, Rafi willingly receives that care, and it changes your life having to care for an adult like that.
Yeah.
But the text, theologically, the text starts with care. The Hebrew Bible is really interested in this.
Mm-hmm.
The care is related to hospitality. And hospitality is about taking care of people's bodily needs. And I think the genius of the Hebrew Bible is that it's subversive in that it tells people to have care and compassion for the outsider and the ostracized. And it's the core of Israel's vocation as a caring community. Whoever oppresses the poor shows contempt for the Maker. Whoever is kind to the needy honors God. That's Proverbs 14. And in this text, I believe the poor and needy are also synonymous with anybody who is on the outside, including the disabled.
Yeah.
So God tells Israel, care for those who are different from you, because you've been in their place. You were strangers in the land of Egypt. And the core, the anchor of disability thinking in the Hebrew Bible, do not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block in front of the blind, but fear the Lord your God. So caring for the bodies of others and being cared for is part of what it means to be a human being. And God tells Israel to protect this whole class of people. And in the ancient world, that was incredibly subversive. Now, we wouldn't survive without care. So my vocation is to care for Rafi. We're all called to care and to be cared for. And I see this as a gift, that Rafi's body is a gift. Being cared for him is a gift. It doesn't mean that Rafi doesn't have the capacity to also care, and he can care. But I think that the proper way to define humanity is to say that we care. That's the mandate that God has given to us.
Mm-hmm.
Caring is the way we understand human life. We couldn't live together without caring.
Yeah.
Care is, I think, the most vital distinction of being in this world. So we're reminded that we care for infants, and that brings joy. We come to terms with caring for the elderly, and it's difficult for many to care for elderly parents. And we end up not wanting to care for them or paying to somebody else to care for them in assisted living.
Yeah.
Our culture insists that taking care of yourself is progress. Not being burdened is good. And I think that robs us of our humanity. So
Mm-hmm.
obviously there's periods of injury and diminishment that I spoke about, but the one who receives care has a vocation, and the caregiver has a vocation. So to have a disability that requires care is not a diminishment of a person or a vocation or of dignity. It's a time, I would say, theologically, when dominion takes on a different form. Anybody and the person occupying that place of needing care is still God's and remains holy and in his image. So to be a human being, like Rafi, is to be loved and dependent and to care and to be cared for. Caring and being cared for, I believe, are part of the same command. Um,
Mm.
and when we avoid caring and when we avoid being cared for, I think it robs us of what it means to be really a human being.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I think one of the things I've noticed the most in caring for my two daughters who are 4 and 8 months, my mom has done a bit of that caregiving with. Actually, she caregives right now for a 11-year-old boy who has Down syndrome, but I haven't done anything like that necessarily. But I know when I was in college, I did. I was a caregiver for kind of an in-home caregiver for elderly folks. I would do that during the summers and Christmas breaks, and that included sometimes with some clients, sort of the routine you were talking about with Rafi of toileting and showering, getting them tucked into bed and stuff like that. But one of the things with all of those instances that is so marked for me is the time difference. The difference in time it takes for like me, for instance, to like use the restroom and shower, right? You can do that in five minutes, right?
Yeah.
But when I'm when I'm going through the dinner routine with my daughters and giving them their nighttime bath, making sure they go, well, at least making sure my oldest goes potty before she goes to bed. Everything just takes so much more time, and so it requires a lot. Like it requires a patience that I wouldn't have necessarily with myself if I were doing those things. So yeah, I'm curious what you think about kind of our cultural framework for time and how we kind of tend to think about time in general in our culture might disadvantage those who are living with disabilities specifically. So how, and then kind of how might like proximity to those with disabilities. So in your case, proximity to Rafi, for instance, how might that kind of change our relationship with time for the better or in kind of maybe a healthier direction?
Yeah, really important question. And our relationship with time is toxic, and it's only getting worse. I spent a lot of time reading St. Augustine, and Augustine writes and thinks a lot about this. And one of the most interesting quotes from Augustine is he says, like, "What is time? Provided that nobody asks me, I know. But if I had to explain it to somebody, I don't know."
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
So, but for Raffi, everything is now and in the present. He couldn't care less about being on time or saving time or wasting time or anything that's efficient or productive. How long does something take? As long as it takes. What does it matter?
Yeah. Yeah. Yep.
It takes as long as it takes. And so that lack of orientation to time and place establishes the major difference in our lives from our lives, from our friends and our peers. Raffi can never be alone. He can't respond to an emergency. He can't organize his day. He can't toilet himself or walk alone. So you could say, oh, Raffi's missing out on independence and intimacy, travel, money, vocation, but I don't think he's really missing anything. He's loved and he loves. He
Yeah.
knows he belongs. He's cared for. And so I try not to compare because that's obviously the thief of joy.
Hmm.
But our culture is obviously obsessed with time. We sell it, we win it, we use it, we measure it, we create it, we insist on punctuality and synchronicity. And this makes absolutely no sense to Rafi whatsoever.
Yeah.
You know, we want to measure the exact location of past events, and we commodify time as a human construct. And it's utterly strange to Rafi. So we find ourselves now, don't we, in a world where to be a person is to have our lives tracked into a rhythm that's measured. And there's this word, that we don't use anymore, retarded. But
Mhm.
retarded is a measurement of speed. And the concept of developmentally delayed is based on this evolutionary model in competitive economic races. What happens to those who can't keep up? And how did we come to construct this kind of normalcy with time?
Mhm.
Someone who can't keep up is retarded. Uh, so we've we're obsessed with these things. We can be anything we want to be as long as we have the time to do it based on our own achievements.
Yeah.
And so our own happiness is tied to this productivity and the productive use of time. Efficiency determines worth. So
Mhm.
as a result, the disabled and those who are different this way are vulnerable and they don't belong. So Rafi, by definition, is locked out. Disability and not achieving goals, being on time is a liability to progress. So the way that Rafi uses his time is incompatible with commodified time. So people say, oh, let's try to make Rafi more productive. How can Rafi be happy or fulfilled if he can't produce anything or do anything or make anything or get a job? But
Mhm.
Rafi is happy. He is content.
Yeah. Yeah.
He is now Rafi is in time and he has a concept of time, but his life is not ruled by it. We are in charge of Rafi's time. So when you ask Rafi to join the world of time, he doesn't like it. He gets
Mhm.
upset, he gets confused. And so we have to stop treating people like Rafi as if they experience time the same way that we do. We have to think about Rafi, we think about everything is in the present. The obvious problem is that Rafi is considered delayed, developmentally delayed. Well, then the question is delayed compared to what? What's gone wrong with our sense of time? Time is this terrible dictator. It's unrelenting. We make appointments, social contracts, agreements, how we use it, how we perceive it. How much time do you have? Is it a good time? When does it
Mhm.
open? When does it close?
Yeah. Yeah.
Are you worth my time? Rafi doesn't have any concept of that. He's always in the present. And so time, is sacred for us. It's mechanized. We're in love with speed. We worship efficiency. So when we think about all of these pieces of our lives, leisure, study, dates, prayer, quiet time, it's ruled by the clock. And our relationship with time and speed is considered to be normal, but I think it's deeply toxic.
Mm.
And because time is commodified as a human construct, it means that Rafi just doesn't belong. And it's an artificial construct. Our lives have a pattern, just like everybody else's. Now, if Rafi were normally developing, our lives would be different, but I don't think they'd be better. Our contentedness flowers by being inside of this time in this space of human difference. The interesting part of Rafi's unusual reading of time is that over the years, friends and family, relatives have died, but he has no concept of that. He thinks they're still living. It's still the present. So he
Yeah.
doesn't experience grief and lament in the same way. So in some ways, it's quite an interesting gift to have.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you've kind of drawn out some examples from the Hebrew Bible. I wonder if we might turn to the New Testament as well. Maybe first we could talk about the cross, right? Because I know that this has been important for for disability theology, particularly. So what would it mean, or what might it mean to kind of read the Passion, to read the cross through the eyes of, kind of specifically through the eyes of disability theology?
Yeah, I think looking at the cross through a disability lens is life changing. The
Mm-hmm.
image, remember, the image of our religious conviction is this cross. The image is not of an able bodied God. We face a broken and a disabled God. And
Mm-hmm.
we assert that in that brokenness, there's a message of grace. When we take the communion elements, we're reminded of a broken, bleeding, and disabled body.
Mm-hmm.
But Paul boasts of all of this. May I never boast except in the cross. And today, it's just so different. Power is praised, weakness is derided. The world
Yeah.
ridicules that claim that God's anointed Messiah suffered on the cross. But when you look at the cross through a disability lens, you think of Jesus' body, and in the ways his body is the same and different. He identifies with us, is aware of the uncertainty and the precarious nature, obviously, of our lives, yet his body was different. How could he be broken for us on the cross if his body was exactly the same? So the theological model serves to remind us and Rafi that the most important body is Jesus' body. His body was
Mm-hmm.
like ours, but unlike ours. And through reflection on that body on the cross, we can understand our own bodies with all of the difference.
Yeah.
So when you affirm Jesus' body on the cross, then you affirm those with different and broken bodies who still participate in the image of God, and confirming non-conventional bodies are still bodies that carry God's grace. So we imagine and we trust that he was physically tortured, he rose from the dead, present in heaven and earth, at once disabled, but now whole. His wounds are visible so that we should not be ashamed that ours are as well. I always wonder if Rafi will still have Down syndrome in heaven. Will he be, or if he doesn't, how will I recognize him? Will he be the same or will
Yeah.
he be different? And I think the answer is yes and no because of the cross. Jesus brings his wounds with him, but he's different. And so when we think of the communion, do this in remembrance of me, we remember the broken God on the cross who is present. We think about his body broken for us on the cross. We have to understand our own bodies, which are the same but different. We're people who are called to delight in weakness and vulnerability. And Rafi should partake in all of that. So I think a lot about what happened with Thomas and with Jesus. Jesus opens his cloak and takes Thomas's hand and puts it into his wound and shows him his disability. Even though he wasn't disabled, he brings his wounds of disability with him. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that's a great model for us because all of us are like Thomas as we look at the wounds of others. And we can learn to offer our own wounds to a scarred and scared world for the healing of others and for the healing of ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
So somehow the risen Messiah still carries the wounds of the resurrection. He brings his disability with him. His redeemed body is perishable and imperishable.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
this disability doesn't contradict the human and divine integrity. It becomes a new model of wholeness and a symbol of solidarity. So will I recognize Rafi? Well, yeah, I will, but he'll be the same, but he'll be different in some way.
Mm.
But I think that his difference is somehow a difference that is a gift of God, and that he, just like all others, was made in his image. And I affirm that he's fearfully and wonderfully made.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe turning to Paul. What about in the Apostle Paul's writings? Do we get any kind of vision of difference and disability in his letters? I know, obviously, we have like his whole thorn in my side, thorn in my flesh language in Paul. Can we kind of make any sense of that if we look through the lens of disability or disability theology?
Oh, yeah. I mean, Paul was a disability theologian.
Mm.
So I have a lot of material here that I've prepared for the podcast. But Paul, for the most part, was counterintuitive when it came to power and weakness. He says that Jesus on the cross was powerful yet weak. He
Mhm.
asserts that we're all judged equally, regardless of disability. In Romans 3, does anybody have an advantage? No, we're all made in, we have already made the charge that Jews and Gentiles alike are all under the power of sin. So any thought of advantage or privilege through Abraham is corrected. God judges all people, regardless of their ability, equally. For Paul, God chooses and makes use of the lowly, the despised, the weak, and the foolish. God chooses the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. And so Paul firmly says that strength and power and standing are not conditions of a relationship with God. On the contrary, he says they are actually barriers. The
Mm.
marginal, the weak, the intellectually different, and the disabled experience God's love. So for Paul, faith is hypocognitive. It uses every sense. He says, in the same way, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit intercedes. So groanings are not incomprehensible, but they are not random or meaningless. Groanings have content. So this notion of hypocognitive means that there are other ways that God approaches and other ways for us to approach him. So Rafi cannot approach in the same way that we think is normal. He can't recite creeds. He
Mhm.
can't assent to dogma or doctrine. His expressive language is often incoherent and rambling. Okay. His expression of desire and faith often emerge in a way that is very perplexing
Mhm.
in the form of groans, deep, inarticulate sounds. They're mystifying to us, but I'm sure that they're understood by God. And so for Paul, this faith is hypocognitive. Faith is under, beneath, or below the cognitive realm.
Mm.
Rafi's faith is a demonstration of this ideal. He's unable to access words for these concepts. He can't communicate cognitive and linguistic representations. But despite that, I have every confidence that the Holy Spirit has a full understanding, right, of what's
Mhm.
going on inside. God doesn't need us to have the right words. And Paul talks about this. So for Paul, Christ is disabled and glorified, weak and powerful, crucified and raised from the dead. And that one thing doesn't negate another. He says he was crucified because of weakness. He lives because of the power of God. Christ is broken, but lives again. Now, much more personally for Paul in Galatia, Paul was not well. He needed help. He needed to be
Yeah.
cared for, right? And he might have needed help with showering and shaving and dressing and hygiene. His
Mhm.
sickness was a responsibility to other people. And he writes that it was because of an illness that I preached the gospel to you, even though my illness was a trial to you. You didn't treat me with contempt. Well, what does that mean? And it's speculation. Some would say that he might have suffered from epilepsy, since the issue of being treated with contempt is a phrase that could have meant some kind of demon possession from the physical manifestation of
Mm.
seizure.
Mhm.
Some think that he maybe had malaria, but whatever it was, he needed to be cared for. And it was inconvenient and he was incapacitated and he was weak. But that's a reality that we all face. God disabuses Paul and us of the fact that we think that we are strong. Eventually, one way and the other, we are going to be weak. Despite all this, Paul knows that his weakness makes him strong. It's at 2 Corinthians. We don't know for certain, what the thorn in the flesh was, but we have to imagine all sorts of unpleasantness and
Yeah.
physical pain. But Paul defends all those limitations and disabilities as something positive, as conduits for God's communication and evidence of God's power. So he views his own disability as reflecting, in some sense, Jesus' death. And he sees in his body the evidence of Messiah's work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, you've offered us so much, offered me so much to glean in our conversation already, and so much for our listeners to glean. I'm wondering, as we kind of come to a close here, are there any maybe final words that you'd like to say, that you'd like to share? Anything you've kind of learned from living in proximity to your son Rafi over his 29 years of life?
Well, I would say the overriding lesson is that proximity to people who are different from you in disability or even worldview or faith or any of the myriad ways that we're different will teach you things that you wouldn't otherwise learn.
Hmm.
Being in proximity to disability and difference will transform mental categories, how you see and think about the world, how you think about your body. Life in proximity to disability and difference just makes you more human. Remember that Rafi can't provide a good or a service. He doesn't have any financial or social or labor capital. And he lives in a world, where efficiency is king and social worth is based on invention or accomplishment or achievement. And
Mm-hmm.
so his life is obviously a unique challenge to us, but not to himself.
Mm-hmm.
And as such, people like Rafi who are disabled are uniquely able to question and challenge, I think, the toxic values that we assume are true.
Mm-hmm.
And so the power to legitimize and acknowledge Rafi doesn't come from these categories of commodification or productivity. It comes really from his dignity, from his humanity, as it should for all of us. Rafi has value and dignity because he's a human being, and it doesn't differ according to people's differences. Human dignity is given, it's not earned.
Mm-hmm.
And final word about inclusion and belonging. Rafi wants to belong. He wants to fit in. He wants to be with people who treat him as normal and with respect. Yet most of the time he doesn't belong. He's excluded as the world races by. Other values have to be agreed upon so that we can discover Rafi's beauty and uniqueness. And I think that inclusion is a wrong word. I think it's a bad word because if you're included, you don't belong. But if you belong, then you're always included.
Mm-hmm.
If you're included, you're not going to be missed if you're not there. But if you belong, then you're going to be missed. And I'm sad that Rafi is often included, but he doesn't belong in so many places. But the most important place that he belongs, obviously, is with us. And for that, I'm really grateful that I have, the resources and the time to be able to take care of him, which has been, an amazing privilege and a terrible burden as well.
Mm-hmm. That's a really, really great way for us to wrap up, I think. One kind of final thing that I always ask our guests is maybe where folks can find you online, if you have any kind of social media accounts or a website or anything where folks can find you. And then if there's anything you want to plug here, any works you have in progress or anything else you might want to share about here.
Yeah, I really appreciate it, Zach. I hope that your listeners would be interested in buying my book, called Human Difference, and it's available on Amazon and at Whiffenstock and bookshop.org. It's also on my website, which is drandrewbarron.com, and some of my writing is there as well, and speaking schedule. I currently teach theology and disability here in Canada at two great schools, Tyndale University in Toronto and Ambrose University in Calgary. And if anybody wants to audit, or take the class as an independent study, or they want to look at my syllabus, they can do that, and they can get in touch with me through my website. I'm working on some follow-up books on this topic, more specifically in the area of disability and mortality and disability and sexuality. But next year, I'm hoping to share some of my research at disability conferences and hopefully next year at the Society of Biblical Literature. I'm looking for opportunities to teach on this topic in local schools and churches, seminars for a day or a weekend. So I'm really flexible. So if any of your listeners are interested, you can reach out to me at drandrewbarron.com, where I have some of my writing and reflection, or feel free to email me. It's Andrew at Barron1, Barron, the number 1.ca. And I'm looking for opportunities to be able to share a little bit about my life and my theological reflection to people who are interested in disability and theology and human care and all the topics, that we've been able to touch on today. And I appreciate your time very much.
Yeah, of course. We'll leave links in our show notes for sure to your book and your website as well. The book title again for listeners is Human Difference: Reflections on a Life in Proximity to Disability. Andrew, thank you so much for taking the time to chat today. I really enjoyed getting to learn from you today. So thanks for making some time.
Hey, I really appreciate it. Thanks.